Welcome to our talk on professional services insights into improving Sitecore XP. So, who are we? My name is Sean Holmesby. I'm a solutions architect working in Sitecore Professional Services. And
hi, I'm James Barrow. I also work in Sitecore Professional Services. I've been here 3 years now. So, what is Sitecore Professional Services? We're a team of professionals who have a range of backgrounds from technical consulting across Sitecore and all our new products, and also across commerce and things like that. What we try and do is we try and ensure customers and their partners get the most out of their Sitecore investment better and faster than they might on their own. We're basically a team of technical consultants who can assist a team, augment a team, and give insight into best practices.
The agenda for today's talk will sort of be chopping and changing. We're going to talk about the Xdb analytics and why sometimes we think they're missing. Then we're going to jump to XM usability. After that, we'll jump back into the Xdb world and talk about big Xdb databases and what you can do with those. And then jumping back into the XM side of things to talk around things like page performance. The big thing is this is not a name and shame session.
Yeah, it's not a name and shame session. Everything in this talk has been witnessed on multiple instances.
Yeah, exactly. Like we have seen this multiple times. And with any sort of development, I sort of go with the belief that there is no need to be embarrassed about your own instance anyway. We are all always learning. We always have something to share with someone else. So hopefully what we present in this session is something that you can take away for your own teams and learn something new that you can actually implement in your own instances. I have an old mantra from my days at Hedgehog where we used to go by the saying, you are not your code. Cool. So just for this session as well, we do have a lot of content, and I just want to highlight the fact that we do have multiple links in this site. So we've gone through and done little shortening links for you. So there's always the URL prefix that you see here. So just write this down now, and so that you have nice quick links that you can add in across the slides when we get to them. So the URL prefix is a bit.ly/SUGCON 2022 ProServe Insights hyphen, and then you add the postfix from each link on the slides. So for example, if you look at this link, you see link intro on the slides, that URL will be bit.ly/SUGCON 2022 ProServe Insights hyphen intro. And if we just go across to that now, you can put that in to a browser and you see that jumps to the Sitecore selfie video. There we go. Woo! Jumping back, just keep an eye out for those wherever you see link and something. Just know that you can have that prefix and then chuck that onto the end for the link, and hopefully that can save you some time and quickly jot down all these links that we show. The first topic is Xdb analytics missing. So sometimes we've had clients talk to us and say, hey, we've got XP. For some reason, our dashboards are not showing anything. And we're wondering, where are they? Why are they gone? Sometimes it's not actually that they're gone or they're not turned on, but it's actually that they're just a little bit delayed. So it might be that you've looked at it and you've got a weak window showing on your dashboard, but actually they stopped or appeared to stop about 2 weeks ago, and they're still catching up and just struggling to keep up with it. So that's the sort of stuff that we're talking about here with why are my analytics missing. So some reasons for why they're missing might be that your connection strings are not correctly configured. So you can see here, there's a link to the app roles. This will go to a link of documentation. So up until Sitecore 9.2, there was this XConnect collection connection string, which was a bit confusing because it was different on CM and CD. The CM should be pointing to the XConnect collection search service, whereas the CD would connect to the XConnect collection role. So the name of the connection string was the same, but they were pointing to different things on different instances. So luckily that was improved in 9.3, where the CM and CD both have pointing to the XConnect collection role. However, there is now a new connection string on the CM called XConnect search, which points to that collection search instance. So that just clarifies things a bit more. One of the other things we've seen is the inclusion of the reporting.secondary connection string. So you may have seen this before if you've ever had to do Xdb reporting rebuild. So that process means you're putting in a blank DB instance, you're running this rebuild, it's going to go through to that second instance, and then you've got essentially 2 reporting DBs at that time. But the thing is, when that finishes, you can see here this documentation says, if you do not comment it out once you're done, basically, it'll continually write to both databases. But when you've done that rebuild, you're supposed to comment it out or remove it so it's gone, and then it'll only go to your new instance. If you keep it there, then the processing needs to point it to 2 databases, and therefore you might have issues, especially if you like scale down the original one, then you can get big delays on your analytics there. Another thing with connection strings, we think that connection strings always exist in that connection strings.config. That is not always the case because there are connection strings in the database. So your shard map manager holds connection strings in there.
Just going a bit more detail on what Sean's just alluded to. The connection strings in the shard map manager, there are a number of tables that this needs to change in. This might happen if you were to move a database server or to back up from a production database to a testing database. Obviously, those connection strings are coming across with the data. So that link should take you to the information about how to change those, how to update those. Relating to the shard map manager connection strings, you might get some issues in Xdb Solar indexes because it has a sync token. There is an error that's shown for this. It says incompatible sync tokens exception. And basically it's related to the fact that connection string is hashed into a token, and that is stored in a few places. I think it's the change tracking tables for when it's storing Xconnect analytics. What happens there is obviously the tokens don't match anymore, the connection strings don't match, and we lose, or the data won't basically be put into the index. In that case, what we need to do is rebuild the index. The information's on the screen there for how to do that. There is an executable that you can run to rebuild the index.
With that as well, sometimes your analytics can fall a bit behind because of those connection strings or some misconfiguration. Also, it might be the case that you just chosen the out-of-the-box configs and haven't actually tuned your instances. So what we have is this processing and aggregation of the analytics going on in the background that push them into fact and dimension tables for the reporting DB. Now with that, you might have more analytics than what the sort of default setup is sort of tuned for, and therefore your processing might not be fast enough. So if it's getting more analytics data from your users coming in faster than it can actually crunch that data and process it, then it'll appear as though it starts to fall behind. So what you can actually do is configure the processing agents. Now, in this case, I mentioned the increase of the max agents. That link there will go to the documentation on this. There are 2 aggregators that we would look at, the aggregator and the contact processing aggregation as well. The documentation will mention a couple of others, which is more for history rebuilds and how you can improve the speed of that. But for general aggregation on your website, these are the 2 that you want to look at. And as I mentioned, you can look at the documentation through that link. The thing that is combined with that is batch aggregation. So you have a number of interactions that have come in a batch that we've said, maybe we've got 200 interactions that we'll batch together, send it across to the database in one go. Let's batch them up and send them over. What you can configure there is the batch sizes. So maybe you want to have less chattiness between your databases and your instances, so you batch up more. And then you have to figure out how well is that being processed in that time. So definitely have a look at configuring those and tuning them to your instance. And if you need advice on how to tune them, sometimes we look at figuring out how the instance is running, double it. If it's not running well, see if that's performing any better. Maybe you have to scale up instances to sort of counter that as well. But there's definitely some things that you can do in the tuning with those links on the documentation.
So switching across to XM usability as our next topic. You had me at admin B. We're basically relating the XM usability around as developers or as a development team. You generally work as an admin user within Sitecore, but your content editors might not. And so you're experiencing something that they might not. It's always good to basically customize or configure Sitecore to make it a more pleasant experience for your content authors. Things like adding insert options, modifying access rights, ensuring the experience editor works, and also if any customizations are being done to that they are in the best interests of the content authors. make sure there's less than 100 child items, and we have processes in place to archive versions as well to keep the whole experience editor and content editor performant. Things like adding placeholder settings as well. But it's not just about a content author being able to do what they want in the platform. It's also, although it seems like we restrict the environment and the platform to them by adding placeholder settings and saying we can only add specific components into specific placeholders, it's more about limiting the options so that it's less confusing to use, and we make it a much nicer experience and much more brand aware.
So lots of these things are the general things that we've done for years with Sitecore development that we all know can improve that experience for content editors, but there's a big one missing here. I've got to give credit to an old friend of mine, Victor, for this one. How Sitecore development works is all about choosing template icons. And one of the great things that we have is a link here to someone in the community who's put together the Sitecore icon selector. So if you go to that, they've got a website where you can do a nice little search through the icons to find the ones that you want, and it can tell you exactly which one you can choose for your template. So very, very handy. So talking also about XM usability, some of the things in tuning it to make it work as quickly as possible, you tune your prefetch caches. Now, prefetch cache is used mainly to start up the site by chucking this into a cache on load. Now, if you chuck too much stuff in, which is great for when you actually get to use it, it might actually slow down the startup time of the content editor. So there becomes this juggle of, do we want our startup times to be quicker versus, hey, when I actually go and click on an item for the first time, is it ready for me in this prefetch cache that has already sort of loaded it in? So tuning that to maybe common items that you might use can help improve the performance of the content editor or experience editor. We also have certain settings that we've seen very useful for disabling. So this deep scan related items talks to when you're publishing and you're publishing related items. There's this whole idea of how down the tree do you go. So here are my items, here are the sub items, here's the related items to those sub items and the related items to the related items. Turning this off means it's only going to go down to one level, so that the deep scan is not going to go so deep. That can save on your publishing performance. And then, of course, we talk about limiting 100 items underneath as child items. But what also happens behind the scenes in the content editor is when you click on an item, it loads its child items automatically. So you can change this setting here, render collapse sections, to false, so that it's not going to do that until you actually go and expand the tree. Again, you might find a bit of a performance hit when you do expand the tree, but then you're not wasting it when you're not looking to expand it and the item is just selected.
There is one around the list manager. The list manager runs a very frequent agent in the scheduler to update the list operations agent. Now, if you're using list manager, you might require this to be a bit more frequent, but if not, what you end up with is a lot of log entries to do with the list manager. If it's not being used, they almost seem a bit pointless. So you can increase this interval to be a bit higher, you get less log entries. There are other configuration settings as well around reducing log sizes, but it's about reducing the kind of confusion in the logs and the amount of logs that are coming through. It's also important just to see, so we can see through all of the mess into what errors or what logs are important to us. Another one is disabling performance counters. This is quite a very frequent one as well, spinning up into, I suppose, IaaS environments and PaaS environments as well, that the counters are enabled by default and they will cause errors in the logs if you have not added the app pool user to the correct group in Windows. So if you're not using these agents, these counters, performance counters, then it might be worthwhile disabling them. And finally, there is the show number of locked items on the button. All of these bits are asynchronous API endpoints that will load buttons in the ribbon. And so turning them off reduces the load on the CM server and can improve performance.
Excellent. So that's XM usability. And now we're going to jump back into the XP side of things and talking about Xdb and what happens if big data has become bigger than you actually thought it would. So we have come across quite large Xdb shards, and these are where your analytics get dumped into. So we want to start to figure out with clients, how big should these Xdb shards be and how big will they get? So you start to do the calculations of, like, per month, how many visitors do you have? How many on average page views do you have per visitor? Multiply that by the amount of times you have recurring visitors per month. You start to then get an idea of what the size of your shards will be by figuring out the typical size of an Xdb contact and an interaction in the database. Yes, you'll have ones that are bigger, you'll have ones that are smaller. On average, we should be able to calculate how big this will be. And then also, how much will it grow? Will you get more contacts and interactions from more visitors coming to your site over time? Hopefully that's a yes. But what we have in professional services is some Excel spreadsheets where we do some quick calculations to assist in sizing out those databases and figuring out in future years, what will you actually need for those sizes and how well might they perform. With the Xdb shards, by default, you get only 2 shards to start with. You'll see this with any script that you've run with maybe SIF or even spinning up in Azure PaaS. The number of shards is 2, but it doesn't have to start at 2. You can actually modify the scripts to have more of them. So when you're starting to do this for your own instance, you might want to say, hey, we know that we have a lot of visitors coming in and the size of the contacts and interactions, and these shards will just grow and they will be quite big. So maybe we want to start with 4 because that'll help us when we do start to hit those limits and the shards are starting to run slower with their queries. So you can start with 4 or even 8 if you wanted to. And you might want to start with that with 4 databases, but on the same database server. And then when you start to see that that's struggling, you might want to move them out to different servers to sort of handle that load. That's a nice way that you can sort of have your shards and you keep them as they are, and you don't have to do anything with them except for scaling the infrastructure that they live on once it becomes a bigger issue. With Sitecore 9.3 onwards, we also have tools that you can split these shards. So if you have 2 and you want to go to 4, you can run the Xdb splitter tool, which will rebalance all that data across the now 4 shards, which would make them more performant with the queries that have been run on them.
So potentially one of the big issues is you have more data than required. And this comes in the form of most likely like too many interactions per contact. Comes in the form of maybe robots aren't being detected. Robots also can be in the form of ping tracks or health checks that can be set up. And if they in particular have sort of static cookies, static contact cookies from the first time they made the request, then they can basically link all of those interactions to it. So we've seen in the past specific contacts that are related to these health checks with 100,000 plus interactions associated to them, which is a kind of crazy number, and it can cause massive issues to the site running. To exclude them in particular from any analytics, we can exclude them by IP address or exclude it by user agents, or there are other methods through customizations we can add into the same pipeline that excludes robot detection, and we can include something else that might be an HTTP header or something else if we've got internal things being called. The next part of it is excluding pages and API endpoints that don't need to be tracked. So there is already setting for this for untracked pages. We can add additional pages into here. So Heartbeat ASPX and Keep Alive ASPX and things like that might already be in there. But we can also add our API endpoints that we don't want to track and we don't want to include in the analytics. If you imagine that your site's running and there is a page there and there might be some sort of check on the page, some Keep Alive check within the page, then obviously every time that API is called, it's going to get tracked into a visitor's analytics, into the interaction, and it's kind of pointless data. There is also another method to do this through class attributes or some other way on API endpoints where you can stop the analytics being tracked. So interaction sizes. So we've just talked about number of interactions per contact, but interaction size is very important as well, because the amount of data that's being passed around the different roles in Sitecore, obviously everything takes up network traffic, so it's important to keep these as small as possible. So if we have a large number of personalization rules on a page, that information will go into the interaction data. If we have a large number of events being triggered, even the same event, then that can end up into the interaction data. And even failed assets or error pages, they can also go into the interaction data. So all of this can bloat the interaction data. And if you were to look at some raw interaction data, you might think that only probably 10% of it is relevant to your analytics or even personalization rules or anything else like that. And the rest of it you might not even know is in there.
Yeah, so with that, when you do look into the shard databases, you can see in the interaction the data that's been saved. And this is just an example of some of that interaction data with personalization. So here we can see a personalization event has been triggered for a particular parent event ID. You could look at that item and say, well, all these personalization events, how many components are actually being personalized? And you might think there's only one or two, but you actually find that your content editors have personalized 10 components on that page. And therefore you have these rule set IDs for each of those components. And when something was actually selected, here's the winning rule. So you can see how this could start to build out, that you have more and more personalization on your site, that all of these gets tracked as exposed rules in the personalization event, and therefore that gets saved in the Xdb. And suddenly this, with all the extra stuff, all the other stuff in interaction data, gets saved in for that one interaction. It starts to make per interaction quite big in that Xdb. So one thing we also wanted to highlight was that you can have information about an MV test go in there. And you might be thinking, well, I don't have any content tests in my Sitecore instance. Why is that showing up? Well, what's commonly overlooked is this little checkbox down the bottom left there of the personalizing the component dialog. This track effect of personalization on this component is checked by default. And what this means is that every now and then MV test will run against these personalization rules to see what's working best. Is it personalization on the first rule, on the second rule, or none at all? So what we can see here is that there's a lot of information going into our Xdb interaction data that people might not even want in there at all. So we commonly tell people, well, what you could do is disable that checkbox by default, or make sure that your content editors remove it, or you can remove it altogether. So these items, they get saved into the content tree in Sitecore System Marketing Control Panel Test Lab. So if you've got items in there, you can see them. What we tell people is to set that setting. There's the link. Set the setting for content testing, automatic content testing enabled to false. That will remove that checkbox and will mean that you won't have these MV test data sections going into your Xdb and not automatically testing your content, which you didn't know was happening before. So also just talking about the Xdb interaction data, here's another page event. Most page events like this are fine. That's what you need, except for this part here, the URL. You can see here that we were tracking the JavaScript file. Now this JavaScript file shouldn't even be there. What we would prefer is that this /scripts prefix is added into the ignore URL prefixes, which we will talk about in a little bit. But the idea is that anything in that doesn't go through Sitecore, it just goes straight to the file system instead. Here you can see this showing up in our Xdb, which means Sitecore is processing this URL. Sitecore goes, hey, that URL, I've eventually found it. It's on the file system, but I've tracked it as a page view event, and that is filling up our Xdb interaction data as well. So looking through some existing interactions, you might be able to find a couple of these and start thinking of ways that you can improve your own site by reducing that interaction data.
Along the same lines, there are a few configuration settings that can be made to clean out some of the pieces before that we were talking about, is sort of bloat of the interaction data, and some of these relate to logging of errors. So if there was a 500 error or something like that on a page inside the site, it gets tracked alongside the analytics for the visitor. However, that might be useful if you are using it, but again, most people aren't using that data and they're tracking those errors in a different way. So if we're not using it, then we can change the setting analytics log level to none. I think its default is error, and also we can remove the register page error processor from the analytics pipelines. Another one is there's another processor in the pipelines for handling page not found. Again, could be useful if you are using it. If you're not using it, might be worthwhile taking out of the interaction data. And then finally, the long running pages. Now, unfortunately, this is part of a processor that is required. However, we can set this to a number that isn't going to basically log them in the analytics data.
So as we mentioned before, excessive page views or events, you might have custom code to trigger a certain event on a click on the page. If you find out that your users are doing that 100 times per page, that's going to log a lot of those events. Also, with page views, we've seen things like a page view is missing an asset or something it's trying to link to, and it calls itself. So you end up having 2 page views per page for no reason. So just being aware of those, testing them out, looking at your analytics data and seeing what you want to remove, like all of this errors, page not found, long running page requests, those sorts of things, you can clean up your interaction data. So with that, what about the stuff that's already in Xdb? Yes, this is great for going forward, but what about all the stuff that's there? So we do have documentation on how to clean up excessive interactions. Now, in the past, this has been SQL scripts that you can run yourself. That's where a knowledge base article there will show you. However, in 10.1, we introduced the Xconnect purging tool. This was greatly improved in 10.2 to include specific interactions that you want removed. But this is great for clearing out possibly old data. You know, I don't want interactions from 3 years ago stored, or I don't want contacts whose last interactions was a year and a half back. That sort of stuff can be done with the purge tool, and there's some great documentation on that. And going back even further, a community tool is the Analytics Database Manager. Some of you may have used this before. This also does very similar things with cleaning up those analytics from your database. But saying that, you know, we have definitely come across our very specific ones for different clients. We do have different sets of scripts that we've put together for removing excessive data, depending on what your specific reasons are for removing it. Obviously, this is more of a business decision to see when you want to remove those analytics or when you don't need them anymore. But we do have a bunch of those that we've worked on. And then, of course, talking about splitting shards and everything, we could use that shard tool I talked about earlier that will rebalance the data across more shards if you want to keep it all. Or if you actually have a bunch of Xdb analytics you don't need, you could start fresh. Take the backup of the ones there, put in fresh ones, start from scratch with your new settings to make sure there's not too much in there. So obviously with huge Xdb databases, it is a big deal that you have these issues because they can start running slowly with the more data that they have in there. So just talking about the big Xdb symptoms and fixes, large session size, that can cause timeout issues. We've talked about Redis and session issues, but maybe the session size itself is large. There's some great explanations of why that might be with historical data going into sessions. So we'd recommend looking into that. If each session is big, maybe you want to do some compression on it so that there's less timeout issues because there's less data to send across the wire with session expiration. So compressing those sessions is something to look into as well. And more recently, the session state provider for Redis has been improved that you can actually switch this over to the async Redis session state provider. So we found great performance gains with that, and I'd recommend looking into that as well.
Another issue we have found is the size of the Xdb indexes. So in a lot of environments, if it's been running for a while and you've got a lot of analytics, the Xdb index size could be 90% of your Solr index sizes. So, you know, your Webmaster Core, other testing indexes, things like that could only take up sort of 10% of the size on disk of your indexes, and Xdb could take up the majority of that. It does index all known contacts and interactions by default. And there is a possibility that you could tweak this data. There are decorators that you can apply to the indexing role. And what they can do is you can look through the interactions or filter the interactions based on specific events that have occurred. So you could filter out events, or you filter in events, or specific pages or specific sites. Whatever you decide to do, you can filter that in to reduce the number of interactions or contacts going into that index. There is a link to a blog post that was quite interesting around the example in the blog post is basically discussing exactly what I've just said, but it provides an example of how to remove, you know, all of the interactions from it. So not to say we recommend that, it's very much a what suits you and what you're using. The index at the minute is used for, on the content management instance, list manager and the experience profile parts of the site. So again, it's worthwhile taking a look at, but it might not be for everyone.
I was just going to say we are running a bit low on time, so we will have to get through this quickly, which means we need some speed. Sitecore is still Sitecore. The CMS performance tuning guide from Sitecore 7 is still relevant today. So have a look through. There's different things you can do for IIS settings, database properties, SQL maintenance and indexes. Those sorts of things can work fantastically for improving the speed of pages on your CM. client optimizations with looking through reducing the number of versions with PowerShell reports. Also, you can look through CD optimizations. Now it's not so bad with the role configs. Just in the past, CDs should not be updating your indexes. You want to set them as manual strategies, so it's not updating them. We mentioned before, ignore URL prefixes. Make sure anything that's a static file that comes from the file system does not go through all the pipelines and processes that Sitecore runs for pages. Just put them in there as the prefixes, so /scripts, /styles, any of those sorts of things go straight to your file system, and it's not going to chug away on your CD instances doing that. CDN's fantastic for offloading our downloads of media assets. And then manage cloud best practices. Now, this is really Azure best practices, but there's some great stuff on this knowledge base article that goes through things like FCN mode, which is like a secret hidden setting that you can change that absolutely performs better with Azure. And there's a whole bunch of other things in there we'd highly recommend you look into.
So Sitecore 9 introduced the config rules, which allowed you to change some app settings to turn on and turn off different configs. It made the core roles, CD, CM, processing, much easier to configure. So we could turn things on and off based on environment, based on the role of the instance and which search provider you're using, and you can provide your own custom configs. It's really useful, and it also means that you can reduce the number of custom configuration that you have in your DevOps pipeline in whichever tool you use, and you can put it into the source repository. And also from that point of view, developers can see exactly what configuration is going to each environment. Obviously, we need to protect connection strings and things like that, but 90% of the config or 99% of the config can go into your repository. So part of those finding performance issues is now we have instead of just the show config, which we can only run on the management instance. If we need to know what the delivery instance looks like without a custom page for it, we could run a show config layers page, which allows us to turn on and off different modules, but also allows us to show for specific rules, such as the role of that instance. So we could see the config for the delivery instance as long as we're using rule-based configuration. Next one is admin pages. So the admin pages are really good for finding performance issues or for tuning performance. We have the stats page, which is the rendering performance stats page. So we can see the number of cache hits. We can see the number of hits on a page. So we can see how many times items are called, how many items are loaded. The cache page, which shows all the caches and how used they are. So are they basically big enough? So we've got a kind of a rule 70 to 80%. If a cache is at 70 or 80%, then it's probably too small. And so it's good, it's worthwhile testing those caches. Pipelines as well, we can see, we can reset basically the collection for pipelines. We can run through some tests on local instances or delivery production instances, and then we can hit the pipelines page and we can see which were the slowest performing pipelines, things like that. We can also enable a diagnostics config to collect some of these statistics on CD servers so that they will save to file system, rather than obviously we can't access those pages which we can on a CM instance. As I mentioned, the caches should be 78% full. If they're lower than this, then they're sort of waste of space in there. And if they're higher than this, then they're likely to be cleared more frequently. Definitely don't ignore the caches cleared messages in the logs. And the most frequent one that we see would be a query string cache or an access result cache. And we've seen these cleared multiple times per request. And that's just basically the access result cache might be too small. That's storing all of the security information, the permissions information about the items that it's accessing. The more roles we have, the more permissions we have, the bigger that cache needs to be. And if it is constantly clearing, then there's no point in it being a cache, because the cache is going to be the quick read for the system. And so clearing the cache just means it has to keep reloading. We need to find a good balance for that cache. Not all of these are as simple to configure as well. However, there's good documentation online around setting the query string cache. The access result cache is actually a simpler one to set. It's really important to cache renderings properly. So that stats page, we can see exactly sort of which are the worst offenders in accessing items from the database and which ones would benefit highly from HTML caching. We can't cache at a top level, because if we cache at a top level, it will cache all the renderings underneath it. So we have to find a good balance around which renderings we can cache to get the best performance. Things like navigation or something like that, those components will access a lot of items because they might look through the entire IA of a site. And so in theory, caching would help in a lot of those cases.
Other performance things that you can improve, so pre-compiling MVC views, again, you could disable them for faster startup, or you could enable them so that when you're ready to go to those pages, those are nice and quick for you. Finding SQL index fragmentation issues. I love the link here. This is from Brian Pedersen from 2012. Improving the indexes by adding some padding to them and rebuilding them for SQL. It's fantastic. I highly recommend it. That has trickled into the Azure SQL maintenance plans that are mentioned here. Having those run every now and then, making sure the indexes are not fragmented and the databases are performing as best they can. Rule-based configs is what we mentioned before for the show config layers. Definitely make that happen so that your instances are running. This is how the default instances are set up as well. But for your customizations, don't just put a config file in a CD instance and not a CM. Put them in both, but have it only apply to the CD if that's the case.
Quick thoughts if you're not using XP's features, so you're using pretty much XM, but you've got XP, considering turning on CMS only mode or not tracking analytics for sites. You can scale down, turn off your XConnect services. It makes sort of life easier, less roles to deal with, less roles to manage, less roles to monitor. So it could be consideration. Based on the back of that, you could consider a move to XM Cloud, so a hosted SaaS platform. And similarly, we have personalize as well, which will replace some of the personalization features of XP. And it's worthwhile staying on top of the technology. So final thoughts. It's very important to create performance and load tests, change one variable at a time. These tests don't have to be overly complex at the beginning. You can always build on them. It's really simple to set up tests. There's great tools out there and great open source tools out there just for you to try. But to set up simple tests, you can do that within an hour or two. So it's definitely worthwhile testing rather than just finding problems in a production environment. Decompiling the code is really useful for debugging and finding issues. It's always worthwhile knowing what's going on in there, and you can discover great insights through doing that. Subscribing to the security bulletin is kind of a must for any Sitecore developer, just to stay on top of what might be released, which hotfixes are in there, and you get notifications about urgent fixes that you should be on top of.
And so going back to what we mentioned before, check with support. If you found a hotfix or a blog post or something that mentions it, check it with support. Make sure that you can actually run that hotfix or patch with them so that you don't run into further issues further down. And lastly as well, get in touch with Sitecore Professional Services or a partner. We can help you, or a partner can help you with your implementations so that you don't run into these issues. You can know some of these things ahead of time, or we can help fix things up for you to make your instance run better and you can get the most out of Sitecore XP. So that concludes everything today. James, where can we find you?
You can find me on Slack.
I'm on the Slack there, Twitter as well, at Sean Holmesby, and also Stack Exchange for anything there.